Good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for coming. A special welcome to all of you in town for your reunion this weekend. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Lauren Noble, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Buckley program. Launched in 2011. Launched in 2011, the Buckley program is devoted to bringing much-needed intellectual diversity to Yale's campus and keeping the legacy of William F. Buckley, Jr. alive for a new generation. Throughout the year, we host a speaker series, conferences, firing line debates, lectures, seminars, and much more. We have a vibrant student fellows program, which grew to a record level of 283 students this year. With the recent attacks on free expression on college campuses nationwide, the Buckley program has played an increasingly vital role on Yale's campus. Today, we're delighted to have an excellent panel of 3 students and 1 alumnus to discuss these important issues. Richard West, Yale class of 1960, and a member of the Buckley program's board of directors, is Dean Emeritus of the New York University's Stern School of Business. He previously served as Dean of Dartmouth's Tuck School. Other appointments include Dean of the University of Oregon School of Business and Associate Dean of Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management. Suffice it to say, he knows a thing or two about education. The author of several books and many articles, Dean West has also served as a director of more than a dozen New York Stock Exchange-listed companies. He received his MBA and PhD from the University of Chicago. Arissa Damron is a senior majoring in English. This summer, Arissa is interning at the Conservative Book Club in Washington, D.C., and in previous summers, she's worked for the Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute and Regnery Publishing. Noah DePonte Smith is also a senior, double majoring in history and political science. In addition to serving as student vice president of the Buckley program, Noah has been a serial Buckley program intern for the past 3 summers, interning at Forbes Opinion, National Review, and National Review again. They must like him or something. And then Pranam Day is a senior majoring in economics and molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. The editor-in-chief of the Buckley program's student blog, The Beacon, Pranam also works as a research assistant in health economics at the Yale School of Medicine. The way this will work today is I'll start off by asking a few questions of our panelists. We really do want to hear your questions, though, so after we get going a bit, please do raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll find you with a mic. I also want to point out that at your tables, you have copies of the recent survey we did on Yale student attitudes towards free speech and intellectual diversity issues on campus. I'm sure we'll talk about that this morning. And also over on my right, we have copies of Campus Speech in Crisis, What the Yale Experience Can Teach America. And our friends from the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education have also provided a memo highlighting some of the issues with Yale's speech policies. So I hope you'll pick up those materials on your way out, and certainly feel free to take more than one and share them with friends. So I'll just get started by asking our panel, can you tell me why you're involved in the Buckley program, and what are your thoughts, generally speaking, on the state of free speech on campus?
Okay, well, I joined the Buckley program the fall of my freshman year. I didn't really know much about it coming in, but I was from the bustling metropolis of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, so maybe my political milieu had been a little bit different from that of Yale before coming in. So when I heard that, I think this was September, October of my freshman year, that the renowned speaker, I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali, was coming, and then was protested and then asked to leave, or asked to have someone else moderate and approve her comments before speaking. That sort of surprised me a little bit. I didn't expect that at an institution like Yale, or really any university. But then to see that Buckley was the program that was bringing her to campus after she'd been disinvited at, I think, Smith, if that's right? Brandeis, sorry. And then how Buckley didn't give in, and that Buckley kept her as the speaker, that she gave a speech that filled SSS 114. She got several rounds of applause. I think students of all political persuasions, all political backgrounds, or even people who were just sort of indifferent just came by to see what the whole hoopla was about. I think everyone came away very, very impressed. So after seeing that, I felt like this was an organization that I should maybe join, put more time into. And then, of course, after the events of last fall, I applied to join the board, and so that's sort of why I'm here now.
I joined the Buckley program also in the fall of my freshman year. I went to a sort of happy hour mingling thing we had at the former Taft Mansion and met some of the girls who became my best friends at Yale. It was really reassuring as an incoming freshman from a pretty small town in Kentucky that I had found these people that thought like me and challenged things like I did and were outgoing and like smart and liked when people talked about things. And then likewise, I attended the Eye on Her CLE event. It was a very interesting experience to see how people protested like the right of a woman who suffered from FGM to speak about the horrors of that, and really turned me on to a critical eye against Yale's students' body like that.
I also joined the Buckley program in the fall of my freshman year. I sort of gravitated towards the conservative sphere on campus when I came, and the Buckley program is quite prominent in that. I wasn't the most active of fellows for the first year of my fellowship. What pushed me towards being more active and eventually taking on a board role was various experiences I had, mostly with extracurricular groups that revealed to me that free speech really was not tolerated on Yale's campus, and that this actually was a problem that needed to be confronted. So once I sort of realized that, I became more active in the program, started to attending more talks, more seminars, and things like that. And now I've taken on a leadership role, and that's been enormously fulfilling. And we've had the opportunity to interact with many very smart people, prominent people in the conservative movement, and to really start to challenge some sort of long-held ideas on Yale's campus that I think are antithetical to the academic spirit and the academic enterprise as it should properly be conducted. So it's been great here.
Well, I got interested in Bill Buckley probably 5 years before I started at Yale, reading God and Man at Yale and things like that. Don't ask me why in East Cleveland, Ohio, but I did. My parents, by the way, were totally apolitical. I had no idea if they ever voted or what they voted, but somehow I got vaccinated. I went to Chicago later and I really got vaccinated, but that's another story. But how I got involved with the program is really very simple. It started, and I started to look at what they were doing and started talking to Lauren, made a check or two out, and asked if I could do other things. And it's been the thing that has gotten me back into a concern and a sense of interest in Yale that I had not had for decades, frankly, other than my class. I'm the class of 60 member. It is a great class. Bart Giamatti was in our class. Jack Hines was in our class. All kinds of wonderful people. At one point, we had the Secretary of Defense, the head of the National Security Agency, and the CIA all at the same time in this one class. A little scary, but it's been wonderful, and it's really these people who have gotten me involved, and I think it's probably fair to say that's true of all the other members of the board. It's what particularly this incredible lady is doing and how she has gotten these kinds of young people involved and motivated that really has gotten us energized the way I think we have become. So, simple as that.
So as I mentioned, the Buckley program recently commissioned a survey about Yale student attitudes towards free speech and intellectual diversity on campus. As I mentioned, the booklet is on your tables. You know, there was some good news and some bad news there. On the one hand, students opposed speech codes by a strong margin. On the other hand, a whopping 70% of students reported experiencing political bias in the classroom, and among conservative students, 71% felt uncomfortable voicing their opinions on issues such as politics, race, religion, and gender in the classroom and on campus. 55% often felt intimidated to write a paper espousing their own ideas because those ideas were different from the professor and might result in a bad grade. So my question to the panel is, what do you make of these results to our students? What's been your experience voicing dissenting views in the classroom and on campus? And to Dick, how do these attitudes compare to your experience, not only as an undergraduate, but as a faculty member and dean at several other schools?
So I guess I never really noticed it until the sort of events of last year and so on, where I think it became maybe a little bit more obvious what people's political viewpoints were, and I think even more so TAs than actual professors. After all, TAs do the bulk of the grading, and they're the ones who sort of talk about the details of assignments and so on. But I think, and I have been lucky enough to be insulated from that in a large degree, just because economics and science don't really have that political tinge in the way that other departments might be. But even then, you're sort of always a little bit on edge. I remember after the election, I think regardless of who you voted for, who you wanted to win, it's a little bit surprising when professors spend the next open lecture the next day with a discussion about why candidate X was bad, and I think we all know who they were talking about in that case. And so you sort of wonder if that's really necessary. Is that part of, French literature, I think, was a class in particular, but is that, I'm not really sure what that has to do, but whatever, it's fine. But then you sort of wonder if that was a more or less isolated experience for me. And then hearing from people who take more classes in the humanities and specifically in some areas of social sciences, you sort of wonder to what degree you're free to write a paper that doesn't match the views of others. And I think we've also seen some issues in terms of student organizations and the sort of hoops that they now have to jump through to be approved that wasn't previously a requirement. And I think Noah knows this better than I do. But we have to do a lot more to get approved, and you have to sort of meet certain standards.
You feel they make it harder for you than other groups?
Probably not harder for us than other groups, but there is quite a lot of diversity training to undergo.
Yeah.
It's like hours on a Saturday afternoon spent hearing, there was this, it was the diversity training panel where for a full hour, they brought in some outside expert on diversity to sort of bring, it was all the student organizations were there in SSS 114, and she would call out sort of certain ethnic groups or sort of identity categories, and then if you were in that category, you would stand up and be applauded by the rest of your people there. It was really bizarre. Yeah, so that's a good example of where things are going now, in that sort of everything is being made to conform to the creed of diversity that actually isn't really true diversity, because everyone still thinks...
There is never intellectual diversity.
Yeah,
that's not really the target or the
everyone
goal.
still thinks the same.
It's siloed diversity.
Siloed diversity, yeah.
Siloed diversity. You have a lot of different people who say, I'm in this silo, and if we have enough silos, we're diverse.
It's also not really economic diversity, but that's a whole separate problem.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm an English major, so you'd think I would not have to deal with politics in the classroom. False. I recently had a children's literature professor tell me that all Republicans were Dementors, the followers of Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter, which was unrelated to life or the classroom, other than that we were discussing Harry Potter.
Did that happen in the classroom?
Yes. There were 5 people in the classroom, and I was one of them, and I was just like, hello. She also openly talked about how she wrote anti-Trump poems to publish and things like that. So teachers who are, in the political science classes, you expect discussion of politics. When I'm discussing Matilda, I don't. You still get teachers inputting their personal life, their personal politics, their personal beliefs of your dementorship into the classroom when you are just trying to discuss literature. And these are tenured professors, not necessarily teaching fellows.
Do you find any difference between when you interact with people who are at the graduate level who are working to be professors? You do interact with some of them, I'm sure, in classes. Do you see any difference between them and more senior faculty in this regard?
Well, the ones who are actively protesting Yale now tend to be a little bit crazier.
Have you noticed any impact because of the unionization issue in terms of what's happening in the class?
I mean, economics will never unionize, so I think I'm safe. But I don't know about the rest of you.
I was in a class where this semester on populism, where I was it was full of political science and sociology grad students. So I think you know their political leanings going in, and yeah, I think they were actually worse than the undergrads were in a certain respect because they live in this sort of hyper-politicized atmosphere of the unionization effort, where it really is sort of functioning like sort of a Stalinist state, and that if you don't support it, you get show trials, and then you get exiled from the whole community. And it was very, very hard to say in that class that actually maybe sort of Brexit wasn't all that bad, and that maybe there's something good about sort of populism. That was very difficult because the class became a strategy session for the Democratic Party. So yeah, the grad students were not great, but part of that I think is that they're just more politically aware and more politically active, whereas a lot of undergrads don't really care that much. They go through the motions and all that, but they don't have a sort of deep commitment. That applies to many undergrads. It's good not to sort of form too many opinions based on the behavior of like a small minority. But with grad students, it's not good.
Well, we have all kinds of people here of all generations who went through Yale and have their own views on, and I'd be somewhat curious to have you tell us. I will say to you that in the late 1950s, Yale was probably more liberal than I was, but I don't think it was liberal the way it is today. But on the other, and in fact, I will tell you a quick anecdote. A guy named Adlai Stevenson came here in the fall of 1956. He was running for president, and he gave a speech on the steps of Wolsey Hall, and he was getting booed by Yaleys. And he literally said, "Smart man, Republican Democrat, smart man." He said in a moment of silence, "I hope a Princeton man doesn't have to teach Yale men manners." They quieted down real fast. But I did see some of the liberal bent, and ironically, I was very much an economics major. I will tell you a quick story. Laura knows the story. I was a Carnegie Fellow, 60, 61. Now, some of you may know what that was, and many of you probably don't. Whitney Griswold graduated from Yale in 28, went to Wall Street, and he had a problem in a couple of years, even with a name like Whitney Griswold. And he went to graduate school, and he became a professor, and 20 years later, he became president. And he reasoned that, and this was at a time when graduate students really didn't teach at all. They might do papers and so forth, but they really didn't teach at all. And he reasoned that there were people who might go into higher education if they had any idea what being a professor really was like. And he got the Carnegie people to give him a bunch of money. And so each year for, I think, about 15 or 16 years, 3 or 4 members of the class became full instructors on the Yale faculty for 1 year. They were not permitted to take more than one course themselves, and they had to teach a course, really teach a course. It was a little bizarre because I was literally in a class with someone who had been in the society where I had been a member of the society the year before. It's a little bizarre. But I decided I wanted to go to graduate school and get a PhD and get into this teaching game. And I told the chairman, a man named Tobin, as in Nobel Prize winner, that I was going to Chicago. I got ostracized. He literally got on the phone with a man named Arthur Smithies. Some may know the name because he was a very famous man at Harvard. And I got admitted to the Harvard economics department over the phone because they were trying to save me from Milton Friedman. They were literally trying to save me from Milton Friedman. I'm not joking. This is not something you joke about. So even among economists, trust me, there's a lot of political economy, but it was different from today. And the only thing I would say is, yes, I lived through all of this in a sense because I was an undergraduate and then I went to graduate school and I became a professor in 1963 at Cornell, and it was different. The Vietnam War really was a an earth-changing thing, not only for a lot of America, but particularly for higher education. You had vast numbers of people in graduate school at that point avoiding the draft. And by definition, most of them were pretty liberal. And they are running higher education today. And the numbers, Yale's no different in this regard, and then I'll stop. You look at the statistics, 25 to 30 in New England self-identify as liberal versus conservative. All you have to do is look at the way faculty give money in political terms. I believe that at Yale, the last time I looked, it's more than 100 to 1. I think only 3 people made a contribution to any Republican, and well more than several hundred gave to the Democratic Party. And by the way, a lady by the name of Christakis, who has really taken it in ways that no one should, gave the maximum money she could to Hillary Clinton.
They both did.
They both did. That's exactly right. So it has changed, and I don't think Yale is very different in that regard, unless you're talking about Hillsdale or Grove City or half a dozen overtly conservative institutions, which bother me a little bit, I must tell you, because I'm not sure they have a lot of diversity on campus either. But it's tough today to be a person who is interacting with faculty, many of whom really do put it on their sleeve. They put it on their sleeve. So.
Yeah, we'll take some questions. We'll just come to you with the mic.
This is not a question, just to follow up on the Stevenson. I was involved in that too. I remember it very well. The interesting thing is that the student body has flipped and that the faculty has not. Don't you think that's fascinating? They were very strongly pro-Stevenson in '55. The student body did boo, and I would say if you'd taken a poll, I remember it well. Yeah. I was then flying down with the Kefauver to introduce him to a big rally down in Kentucky. But I remember that I was so disappointed.
Yeah.
I thought that at least there'd be a balance.
Yeah.
But isn't it odd that the student body has flipped? I'd like anybody to comment on that, particularly.
Well, I'll give you. No, you guys go. I have a thought, but you go.
I don't know the exact politics of the 1956 election, but it's interesting that the faculty here are overwhelmingly Clinton supporters. Not partially probably because some of them wanted jobs in the administration. Sorry, it didn't happen. But the students, I think, are by and large Bernie Sanders supporters. I don't know if Rivers and Pranam agree with me on that, but
maybe
almost
the
everyone
ones who are very actively and openly involved in politics, maybe. Because I think they're the ones that we hear from the most. But I think the vast majority of people who are politically sort of apathetic probably voted for Clinton more so than Bernie.
I'm trying to remember back at the polling numbers from the library polling station. I think it was pro-Sanders by a bit, but the students are substantially to the left of the faculty right now, at least politically. In terms of free speech issues, probably to the left as well. We should poll the faculty at some point.
I think the majority of faculty are Democrats, and the majority of students are leftists. Like, no question. The number of people Yale students supporting Bernie Sanders and taking down the 1% while being Yale students was alarming.
Well, it is true that the student body in higher education is very different from what it was. And I think it's, by definition, more liberal than people who aren't going to college, for example. There are 2 people whose work I commend to you if you'd like to think more about this, and they both Yale graduates. One is named John Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. John is a professor at the Stern School, where I was once dean. And the other is Heather McDonald. And they both write a lot about what's happening, and they have very different views. John, I think he would not disagree with me that his view is partly in the snowflake camp, that today's youth have been coddled by parents and this and that, and this has led them to not want to get into controversy. I don't buy it completely because, as Heather has said, that doesn't seem to explain why heterosexual men, on average, are less conservative because they had the same parents. Her argument is this is ideological. It is based on a view that says Western civilization is flawed in major ways that are endemic with regard to race and sex and homophobia and xenophobia, and that this particularly has been imbued in a percentage of younger people through the education system. You didn't learn that in the womb. You learned it from people who inculcated it, and it started before college. And her argument is that this is what is really the issue, and the key is, because of that, it is putting down people like this because they are viewed as being violent to these special silos by virtue of expressing thoughts that are different from theirs. And because those thoughts are different, they are challenging them, and the people who are being challenged by them or view themselves as being challenged have a right to come back at them. And they are challenging them rhetorically, and they're being challenged back physically. And I happen to buy Heather more than I do John, but they're both interesting thoughts.
Can I make a small point?
Oh, wait, hold on, can we just get the mic?
I'm Andy Glass. Live in Washington, D.C., and I've earned a living, a good one, as a journalist. I want to commend the panel, and particularly Dean West, for saying what needs to be said. So I was in Wolseley Hall on Saturday night when Governor Stevenson came to Yale. And what was interesting about that, and we forget, is how important newspapers were at the time. It was a Saturday night, and what was important is that the New York Herald Tribune and the New York Times had already gone to press with their Sunday editions before Stevenson spoke. As a result, the speech never got the traction that it otherwise would, because the hope of the Stevenson people was that the booing of the Democratic nominee would somehow result in a pushback and get him votes. It was not going to happen. But I'd just like to make this other comment, that the press, I worked for the New York Herald Tribune, which was ostensibly a Republican newspaper, but my generation of journalists believed in a code and a word that is not in use these days: disinterested. Disinterested is much different than uninterested. We were taught not to have an opinion, just to tell people what was really the hell going on. And what you see today is, of course, a much more polarized press. Even William Buckley, who I knew slightly, had a lot of friends among liberals, and
Gore Vidal.
So Gore Vidal is a good example. Socialized with them. So that division that occurs today is regrettable.
I guess I'll ask another question. So there seems to be a tendency, I think, in some circles to dismiss or deny or minimize the free speech problem on college campuses. So, for example, the Yale president had written an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last year about the infamous Halloween protests and noted, this is a quote, "I cannot remember a greater display of free expression since I arrived at Yale as a graduate student in 1981. On the other hand, in other circles, I think that there's a tendency to recognize the problem very readily, but almost become so outraged by it that some people just dismiss college campuses entirely as bastions of political correctness and not really worth fighting for. So how do you respond to these points of view, and are there any signs of hope?
You're going to be graduates now. You're giving us 4 years of your thoughts now. How do we deal with this problem?
Okay, so on the Peter Salovey front, I genuinely think Peter Salovey does not believe that students are at all opposed to the renaming of Calhoun or to the treatment of the Christakises. I think he thinks that all the opposition to that is coming from the alumni. So good job, but thank you. And it's because the way that conservatives on campus express themselves, it's simply not happening in the public sphere. It's happening in sort of private Facebook groups, in text message groups, in sort of covert conversations, not in public places. Don't have them in coffee shops, really don't. So I don't know how we get past that problem, except like it's tempting to just say, oh, well, these conservatives they're just snowflakes of a different sort. They can't handle any sort of opposition to their views. But that seems to like totally sidestep the issue. I don't know. Do you two have any thoughts on how conservatives can make themselves more heard and more accepted in the Yale public sphere, as it were?
Don't be afraid of death threats. You'll get
That's
them.
one.
If you're going to speak out on a conservative issue, you'll get them. People will tell you to leave.
mean that, really?
Yeah,
Yes,
Arissa, do you want
genuinely.
to talk about your
Yeah.
experience, Arissa?
Oh, yes. So, last fall, before the great Halloween incident of 2015, I went on Fox News to talk about how I was disgusted that D. Ray McKesson, a Black Lives Matter protester who said that white people should be eradicated, was coming to teach a leadership class at the Divinity School. Within 12 hours, I was on at like 7 a.m. on a Saturday. Within 12 hours, I had a long chain of comments on a Yale Facebook group about how I needed to leave campus, how I should die, several things that are not appropriate for this setting to say. I actually screenshotted most of them and sent it to the president, Peter Salovey, saying, my life has been threatened. I wasn't genuinely worried because these people are confined to the internet, They would never dare say something to me in person. I got no response from the administration to threats against my life. No. I had several people reach out to me and say, they weren't comfortable, living in my same dormitory because I was a raging racist, things like that. That all because I said that I didn't think this guy who once literally said that white people should be eradicated was coming to teach a leadership course and being paid, even though he has a bachelor's degree in mathematics.
The death threats thing, I used to be a reporter for the Yale Daily News, and the YDN got death threats during the November 2015 protests for reporting actually slightly slanted to the left coverage. There were a lot of death threats out there.
Yeah, but they're all from people sophomores on the internet who think, I am going to tell you to go die, and then they go back to doing their homework or watching Netflix or something, and they never actually act on it. So my mother
That's
reached
good, right, I think?
Yeah, I think that's a good thing.
That's a
but
good thing.
the fact that they
gonna say
feel
that.
comfortable behind the anonymity of the internet to threaten people's life. My mother reached out to me and tried to hire security as if other Yale students were actually going to come and hurt me. They're all just on the internet, threatening people and then going out about their lives.
Well, I think
Protest, by conservatives against these. I'm sorry. Against these threats, against these movements to stop free speech.
I mean, I think-
have you gotten out in the streets?
I think after seeing what happened to Master Christakis and his wife, and a tenured professor, a really big name professor, master of a college, head of a college or whatever, I think after seeing, if that can happen to, the head of a college and his wife, then I think most students have sort of connected the dots that that's not really welcome.
Right.
Well, back in our day, I was at NYU, and Young Americans for Freedom, there may have been, 100,000 students out there protesting one way, and we were sitting over maybe 24. And we took a lot of flack. But in the end, we made as much of a difference as the 100,000 because there was people standing up.
Yeah.
One thing that did happen is the Buckley program got a lot more fellows after November 2015. I think we had probably 120 back then, up to 280 now. And there's been a lot of good discussions, a lot of actually liberals who just feel really disillusioned with the way the campus is going, come to the Buckley program. So maybe that's our own form of protest or activism. And we do get a lot of flack as well. Yeah, just go on the Yale Facebook groups to see that.
I think
it's
that's-
not fun, but
I think there's something to be said.
It is a very tough problem because, in part, there's no evidence, despite, I don't want to get political about the campaign, other than to say, you've heard arguments that from both sides there has been physical violence, and particularly from Mr. Trump. Among students in higher education, there is no evidence of conservative or non-radical leftist students being violent. There's a lot of evidence of fringe groups, and they are fringe groups. That's the good news. We're not talking about massive numbers of really violent people, despite they may use the word kill you, words kill you, but they probably won't. But that really damps down people who are not willing to come back with violence. When people are doing what they were doing to those wonderful people right in their faces and just about with their fists, it really puts down the willingness to stand up unless you're prepared to really be put down. And I'm not talking about cowardice. I'm simply talking about not wanting to be physically confrontational. Part of this business of arguing with words is different from arguing with violence. All you have to do, I mean, the gentleman who got put down at Berkeley is not a nice person and probably doesn't deserve to have a lot of time on any campus, liberal or conservative. But if you had watched what the people who were attacking everything in sight at Berkeley were doing, that's scary stuff. One other comment. The good news is programs, particularly the Buckley program, but a few others around, are making a difference, if only because they're providing an opportunity for students to interact outside of a chat room or a coffee place and feel that they can talk to people without being shunned or ostracized or what have you. And I mean, we're not into the business at this point, at least, of franchising Buckley programs. We've actually talked about it. No, it's a Yale program. But it'd be great if there were more programs like this that at least could begin a process, because I don't think you can see it automatically just rise up among the relatively few conservative students who are prepared to say, like you did in a different world.
But you know, the difference back then during the Vietnam War was the interaction in the classroom was phenomenal. Yeah. It was, we had discussions that went on till 4 o'clock in the morning. This classroom just never ended. And maybe we've gone to, you know, a bar somewhere to continue it, but they continued and they continued civilly.
I gave passing grades to everybody at Cornell in '67 when the black students were on the cover of Newsweek with the guns at the president's house. But you're right, outside of class, people did talk with each other, even if Dan Berrigan was there screaming at you.
Sort of a great segue to my question. I graduated 20 years ago. My roommate for 4 out of those 4 years was a self-proclaimed communist, and he's a good friend of mine teaching down at NYU today. And but we had those conversations in our dorm room together, maybe with a pint of Ben and Jerry's or two, or maybe a beer, and I'll never forget it, for years, and it was always a wonderful thing. And he was in the Yale Political Union, I was in the Yale Political Union, and those conversations and discussions and debates could be had there. So I'm trying to relate to what's happening today just relative to 20 years ago. What's happening, and maybe this would be helpful for other alums, what's happening at a forum like the YPU? Is there tolerance, a conversation taking place, excuse me? Who are the types of people that the YPU is inviting? what's happening there in a very Yale-centric traditional forum. Thank you.
So Yale's extracurricular culture has sort of, over the last probably 5 years or so, started to atrophy. I think there are various reasons for this. Students start to overcommit to like way too many things and end up doing nothing for any of them. But the YPU especially seems to have declined pretty significantly in terms of people it's inviting, student interest. Reading YDNs from the 1950s when like half the campus is a member of the YPU. Not anymore. They're having serious problems like getting people going to debates. The parties are still pretty active, some more so than others, but if anything, I think the Buckley program has sort of started to supplant the YPU in terms of like inviting high-profile speakers and things like that. One thing I'll say about the sort of being able to talk with anyone about what you think is that that has now become predicated on that person believing in free speech. And sort of the set of people who believe in free speech tends to have relatively similar political views. So if you want to talk to a communist, they do exist, they're still here, that's going to be really hard to do because they typically aren't the people who believe in free speech as sort of a virtue on campus. So there's sort of been a coming apart of the political sides in that way. I guess the solution is to say this, you just have to believe in free speech. But how do you even start to convince the person of that when their prior is so different? That's a really hard task, and I think it can only happen at sort of the institutional level of Yale actually living up to what the Woodward Report says, and more than that, trying to foster a spirit of intellectual community on campus. But that's a really hard task.
The YPU invited, for example, this year, broad spectrum, was it all left?
It was.
It's been broad. They invited Jonah Goldberg from National Review.
Yeah, they had some pretty. They had.
Bill Ayers, known terrorist.
They had Lincoln Chafee, who was one of the Democratic. He's funny to see in person.
Jill Stein?
Jill Stein came.
Yeah, Jill Stein came.
Jill Stein came. Yeah.
I think Jill Stein came the day of Bulldog Days.
She was here for Bulldog Days.
And the day after, we were setting up our booth for Buckley, and I think her coming actually boosted our turnout. So I suppose thanks to her for that. She's so crazy that she drives people to us. I mean, something to be said for that, I suppose.
When I was a freshman, the first YPU debate I went to, which is why I did not join the YPU, was Reverend Al Sharpton, which is an eye-opening experience about what I would later deal with at Yale.
Well, I think for what it's worth, the YPU is, and the people who are in it are probably the people who are most, or at least among people who are on the left and in YPU, they're probably people among the left who are the most welcome to hearing opposing points of view because they do so on a weekly basis. Whereas there's a whole other set of people, and I would like to think that they're small, and probably are small, who are completely opposed to that, who just don't want to hear anything that challenges their preconceived worldview, who write.
You're attacking them.
Yeah, because there's this whole conflation of,
Thoughts they don't
words
like
with
are
violence.
viewed as violent from
I think
their
that's the
point of
attack
view.
used against Christakis and his wife as well, that if you say something that we disagree with, you're enacting violence upon us,
Yes.
and then that sort of leads to the sort of follow-up that, is it not right to self-defense? Can we not respond to violence with violence? Then that sort of gets into some dark places. But I think, yes, I mean, to the extent that the YPU remains a presence on campus, and it probably still has 150, 200 some people, maybe?
Yeah.
So that's like decent sized, if smaller than it used to be. It's still a place where there is a regular conversation from different political spectrums. I think Buckley is, like Noah said, doing a bit of a better job with that in that we get way more turnout for our events, I think. I think when we filled SSS for Ryan Hersili, we filled SSS and we had a massive line outside for Dr. Ben Carson.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We filled the Omni Hotel ballroom for J.D. Vance, and that's a big room to fill.
It was almost 800 people.
Yeah.
So, there is
Well,
a demand.
Yeah,
I'll
from
give you
YDN the next day.
I'll give you an example of why this is the right way to go. I was on the faculty at Dartmouth when something called the Dartmouth Review started. And because the faculty at Dartmouth, and we're talking the 80s now, was pretty liberal, and the Amos Tuck School faculty was probably marginally more conservative, people like Laura and Dinesh D'Souza and so forth as we would put it, came down Tuck Drive, if you happen to know the Dartmouth campus, and visited us a bit. That's still there. That thing still exists. But there is nothing at Dartmouth that has the breadth of this program. You have a small group of relatively conservative students at Dartmouth who run a magazine, but it doesn't do the kinds of things. I know I'm now proselytizing for the program, but I really
Keep
believe
going.
this. It is doing things that I don't think are being done on most other campuses, and thank God you have a name like Buckley, which makes it more livable than some other names might be today, but it really is different from many campuses, and I think we're all lucky just to have this woman. Trust me, without her, it wouldn't be here.
Further
I wanted to tie together two streams of the conversation here. One is the comparison to other campuses, and the other is the important question of what the safe harbors are for conservatives on campus. And I note that at places like Harvard and Princeton, there are faculty that can be turned to. At Harvard, there's not much, but there's Harvey Mansfield and Ruth Vissa. And, at Princeton, there's Robbie George. There's the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton. Stanford has the Hoover Institute. Okay, we don't have those, but are there, let me ask the students, are there faculty that you can turn to?
Well, there's actually a list of there was a petition put around during the great Halloween incident with Christakis, where a list of faculty sort of signed a petition in defense of Christakis. And I think that was led by Douglas Stone in the physics department, and then he wrote a piece in the New York Times defending Christakis, well, defending both Christakis, actually. So I think there are the Christakis, I don't know. The Christakis, the Christaki, whatever we want to say. They're great people. So I think that there are definitely faculty who are sort of in support of Buckley, in support of what we believe in support of free speech, whether or not they're conservatives or Democrats, I mean, whatever the case may be. But I think a number of them, because they also signed their affiliations on the petition, a number of them are not in departments, or the vast majority of them are not in departments that are political in any sense. Like they're massively overrepresented in physics and engineering and Christakis' own department. So I think you hear less from them than you do from some other faculty who are on the left and are in, say, political science, and you hear much more from them than that. But I think we've had a fair number of faculty who have been willing to come to our debates, who have been willing to participate in our debates. We had William Nordhaus in the economics department who participated in one of our debates. And I think he talked about Hill Buckley in class as well. So I think he's, whatever his political beliefs are, he's at least supportive of the idea that there should be a sort of a vibrant political positions on all sides.
Well, one of the things that I'll say it, I feel that way now after a couple of years, have tried to do is not only bring some speakers who are different from some of the speakers who are currently coming, but create opportunities for two views to be expressed and discussed. The firing line thing, for example, by definition is designed to get a discussion going with a diversity of points of view, as opposed to we have to do things that other people aren't doing and just bring speakers that other people don't bring. And I think that ought to, the seminars that, have any of you participated in them? Let's talk about that a little bit. The seminars have been very well received by students who are not necessarily interested in the Buckley program itself. Talk about that.
I've attended 2 or 3 of the spring break or Thanksgiving or October break seminars so far on like democracy in America, the morals of capitalism and such. And there's a good turnout of students who are either not involved with the Buckley program or I know are Democrats, liberals, things like that, who we end up having some really good conversations about the texts, about actual issues, and it doesn't resort to ad hominem attacks because it's a safe space for everyone to actually discuss things and discuss, democracy in America, we have this text before us, let's talk about it then, now, and where we're going with it, and everyone from all sides of the aisle feels comfortable. So I'm always amazed by when I walk into a Buckley seminar and I'm like, oh, they're here. But then it turns out fine. And it's great, and they bring new things to this table, and it's always great.
I want to begin by commending everyone in front of the room for their efforts and their leadership in this area. It's not easy to do. and you talked about some of the difficulties. I want to suggest that something strikes me as, how is it, I have this terrible sense of deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra would say. How can we be surprised? How do we maintain this sense that we are somehow surprised and outraged that this is going on? Because in fact, isn't this incredibly predictable? The rhetoric is predictable. The thinking is incredibly both predictable and sterile. The tactics are knowable. And it seems to me that this issue of consistent surprise is a huge disadvantage. How can we be surprised at the tactics, and why are we not spending time to lay the intellectual groundwork for saying, what's the alternative? You say that we're here to put people in chains. No, let's tell you what we're here to do. Okay, you've got tactics around blocking buildings. We got counter tactics. Don't be surprised when they do this. This is what you do. When you get in an argument, you're going to hear the same, rhetoric over and over. Here's how you counter it. And it seems to me that we on our side, and I'll say we're on our side, have done a very poor job strategizing and organizing people to do that without going to creating violence on our own part. That's not what I'm suggesting. So in the spirit of both commendation and productive dissatisfaction, it seems to me that there's a lot of work to be done to begin to anticipate what is completely predictable and counter it and create areas where we can begin to drive the narrative in our direction. So
I will make one quick comment. I mean, in terms of surprise, we've actually, we did have some protesters outside of our event, our annual conference actually, on free speech, which was during this whole Halloween debacle, and there was a student who ended up getting spat on and called a racist. But the people I will commend at Yale for defending free speech actually are the Yale police. They were really great at making sure that our conference still went on. I mean, there was an effort to disrupt it, but they were there and they did a wonderful job. They've done a wonderful job with when we've hosted Ben Carson and when we've hosted Ben Shapiro and other names that are also Ion her CLE. So I will say I can't speak for other schools, but when we've known that there might be some issue, we've always tried to be prepared, and that's why I'm always surprised, I shouldn't say no. Oh my gosh, I'm not surprised. It's always interesting when you see at other schools preemptively canceling speakers, citing security concerns, or saying, we can't possibly provide a police presence for that. But if you're just prepared, for Ion her CLE, there was a bomb-sniffing, dog who went into the lecture hall beforehand. So on that front, I think maybe some other schools aren't prepared, but we've had a very good experience with the Yale police.
Please don't read that as criticism. I didn't mean it.
Oh yeah, no. I see your question. You're onto something.
Your point is well taken, and the dilemma is that they are willing to use tactics that we're not willing to use. Our big dinner each year is called the Disinvitation Dinner, and if you've not been in New York, please come. It's wonderful. It's because of people who have been disinvited. In some cases, they've been disinvited by told not to come. In other cases, they have been shouted down. And in other cases, Mr. Murray recently been, at least people with him, physically abused. Well, we're not into that, and as a result, you're right. It's tough for us to come up with simple but effective approaches to, other than saying, let's put a firing line together and get two people to talk. So, but you're right, I agree with you.
I think one of the most effective things in kind of new, innovative ways people have kind of combated this leftist on campus is the Yale College Republicans, while the great 8 brave people were, risking their lives and starving, they put together a barbecue on the Beinecke Plaza right next door. They took preparative action. They consulted Chief Ronald Higgins and had permits and made sure they had all their stuff, and they showed up with some barbecue and people hung out. It was one of those kind of quirky protests that was still very effective at getting their name out, made national news, but they didn't have to get violent. They stood there and ate some barbecue and mac and cheese.
Grad students were
Grad students
were
were
not.
so mad. It was great.
But the barbecue was really good, so I mean, trade-offs.
Just wait for the mic, 1 second.
I think he's right on target. It just seems to me that this play has been running for quite some time now, and it is sort of dismaying that we are shocked, if not surprised. I still find that I should be inured to this by now, but honestly, some of the stories that I see reported in the press, they still have the power to shock me with some of the things that are going on. But I would think a couple of things. I don't really understand the mentality of these people who are against free press, free speech. So I wonder if you could address that a little bit with the thought in mind that if we understand their mentality, we might find points of vulnerability, and then have more or less a systematic response that could apply not only to Yale's campus, but elsewhere around the country, so that we aren't caught flat-footed and sort of in a state of shock, but have some sort of potent response to counter these people. But I understand a huge obstacle is they are not open to discussion, which would be the traditional way to undermine an opposing argument. So I wonder if, sort of as a related thought, have you discovered in the course of your experience any cases in which you've been able to successfully argue against this opposing point of view?
So one thing here is, I think we can take a good example from what the University of Chicago did in August, I think it was, which they just sort of preemptively published a letter saying, we are not a safe space university. We are going to do free speech, and that's that. One of the virtues of the university administration is that it is sort of an autocracy. So what the president says goes. Depends who you have as the president then, which Chicago is more blessed than we are. But the other way to do it is just to start at the very roots and start capturing people when they're our age. And you have to realize this will take 20 to 30 years to come to fruition, and that we may not control the academy until then. But at least we're sort of watering the seeds now. So besides the sort of autocratic route, I think that's how you have to do it. In terms of arguing people out, or
I think there's something to be said for having conversations with people that are sort of one-on-one conversations, or in very small groups where you already know the person personally. I don't think a lot of students, and maybe I'm naive about this, but I don't think a lot of students come into Yale thinking that they'll be joining a group that's cursing out a professor in the middle of Silliman Courtyard. I don't think, that's why, I'd like to think, and I'm reasonably confident that that's not why people come to Yale. But I think when you come to Yale as sort of a freshman, you're new to the whole thing, and then when you're immersed in this environment where depending on your political viewpoints, depending on who you end up with in your freshman suite, if you're that unlucky, that's what you see firsthand. Then there's a sort of vague echo chamber effect where you become you get pushed further to the left. And so whether you fully believe all the arguments that were laid out against Christakis or not, or if maybe you were just mildly uncomfortable from the email, but you didn't quite feel like going all the way to demanding resignations and chalking outside their home or whatever. So I think if you have or at least I can say this from my own personal experience, which is obviously just anecdotal, but having a conversation with someone that you already know, who you might disagree with, in a one-on-one setting tends to be a lot more productive than it does when they're in this sort of group setting and they don't want to sort of lose face with their more woke friends or what have you.
I'm going to read you a quick paragraph from Heather McDonald. It's from a piece in the Wall Street Journal. Campus intolerance is at root not a psychological phenomenon, but an ideologically one. At its center is a worldview that sees Western culture as endemically racist and sexist, and I could add to that. That's where she ends. The overriding goal of the educational establishment is to teach young people within the ever-growing list of official victim classifications to view themselves as existentially oppressed. One outcome of that teaching is the forcible silencing of contrarian speech. And we're now back to the point, speech is viewed in of itself as violence, and therefore real violence is not violent, it's self-defense. So but that's the point, is you really do have to get into what's going on. But when you get into it, it isn't easy. It just is not easy. I wish there were more people like the president of Chicago. There aren't. The president of Wesleyan, if you maybe know what's going on, is proposing affirmative action for conservative thought on campus. God bless him. It sounds ridiculous to say this, but he's put it forward. On the other hand, the president of Northwestern University, who used to be the president of Williams, has given 2 or 3 interviews in the last 3 or 4 months about the importance of safe spaces. And I'm not talking about safe spaces for conservatives. I'm talking about safe spaces for people who have been marginalized in every way for hundreds of years from the perspective of this ideology. So it's tough.
Yeah, I think he's totally right. There was an argument that was made in a magazine talking about how we should shut down directed studies because, from a student who's never taken the course, because it challenges his beliefs and his existence and all of that, and because he doesn't like what is said, and because he doesn't, because he believes the books don't, that the authors of the books don't look like him, that these books and texts should just not be taught. And so if you're at the point where you're willing to say that this long-standing tradition, this class that a lot of people take, a lot of people love, that is a major part of the Yale experience for a lot of people, should just be shut down because you don't like it, then, I mean, at that point, what more is there to be said?
They did the same thing with the English department and trying to outlaw Shakespeare because he's white.
Talk about
as if
that,
that's his
because
fault.
some of you
Yeah.
may know, but others may not. What's happened in the English department?
Right, so there are 2, or there were, because we'll get to that, 2 required English courses called Major English Poets that covered Chaucer, Donne, Shakespeare, Eliot, those things that everyone has to read, the Canterbury Tales, the sonnets, etc. And it's required that you take both of them to graduate as an English student. It's 2 out of 14 classes. Some people who will not be named, though they are identified, started a petition to decolonize the English department. That was the word they used, decolonize, because having to read Shakespeare and Chaucer and only dead white men was oppressive and negated them as women. Shakespeare looks nothing like me, and I'm not offended. It was a lot. They ended up changing it slightly, so you only have to take one of the 2 courses. So you might graduate from Yale having never read Shakespeare
As an English major,
which is ridiculous. Trying to say that you should why can't we just read Toni Morrison instead, as if Toni Morrison herself did not learn from Shakespeare. So they're really not receptive to the idea that this canonical history has shaped all the writers of color that they do want to read.
We had a question in the back. Yeah, wait for the mic.
That's all right. Go ahead. You're the better half in this group. Come on.
No, we ran into Bill Buckley and Chris at a restaurant on 36th Street where he frequented, and my daughter had just gotten into Yale. And I had known Bill and Jim from my YAF days, and I went over and I was so proud. I said, Mr. Buckley, my daughter has just gotten into Yale, and he looked up from the table and he says, I hope she survives.
I want to, and we want to give them the last things seriously, but I would like to say 2 things. First of all, this woman really is unbelievable, and without her, none of this would be going on. That's the first point.
How is this going to carry on?
Well, the board talks about what would we do if, and the answer is we don't know right now. So we're worried about it, but she's young and healthy, and she likes doing what she's doing. But the other thing I want to say to you is we do need support from you. We don't get anything from the campus, and you can support us in your reunion year. You can actually get credit for a class gift and have the money go to the program. The rest of the time you can't. Don't ask me why, because they've been willing to do it with the reunion classes, but they haven't been willing to do it generally. But at reunion time, you can make a gift that will get you class credit, go against your great classes' achievements for the year, and support the program. And if you're interested, we've got lots of other ideas that we want to support. So it's not as if we don't have other good things that we can be doing. All of them, by the way, consistent really with what's been going on now. Diversity of thought, freedom of speech.
The reunion gifting is crucial. So Mark and I are both here at our 25th reunion, and Yale's been asking me, to donate, which I've done, over the years, but asking for more money now. And I waited to see. I wanted to see what these students were going to say. I wanted to see what their experience has been recently. And I'm very curious, and it was interesting to hear some of the comments about what the administration is doing to protect free speech on campus and to protect the promotion of contrarian views and opposing views. To me, that's the wellspring or the lifeblood of a liberal arts education. And I've sort of been concerned about, how Yale is handling that. So I would get that reunion gift message out, because I was sitting
We're
here
doing
listening
our
to what
best.
you say, and I was thinking, I'm just going to donate my gift to the Buckley program, because that is going to help
Thank
Yale
you.
more than anything else. So,
Thank you.
But I didn't. But I was weighing it, and if I had, if more people knew that, I think that would be, a way to give to Yale while also supporting the Buckley program. So get that word out more.
Why don't you guys make some comments
Yeah.
to end this?
I have many friends who are involved with YF and things like that, and go to UC Berkeley and places like that, where their administration is seriously anti-free speech. And I don't think the Yale administration is taking action to prevent free speech, but they're not taking the actions necessary to allow it. Many of the times they're allowing student protests like this. They're allowing people to shout down professors, to shout down other students, and they definitely need to step up to the plate. And those, one Wall Street Journal article isn't enough these days.
And the campus without the Buckley program would be a greatly diminished place, both in terms of intellectual activity and just the diversity of views we get to hear. So this is sort of one of, I think, the great academic institutions at sort of the elite American universities, and I'm really thankful we have it here. And I'm thankful I went to Yale and not somewhere else as a result.
I think Yale is partially as a result of the Buckley program, but also because I think we are very thankfully not places like Middlebury where protesters will beat up a professor and send her to the emergency room. So we've never gotten anywhere near that. And so for what it's worth, Yale is probably better off than most places that I've heard of, aside from perhaps University of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And Yale's an amazing place. I've loved my 3 years, and I think most of us have still. Whatever our complaints may be about politics, as the administration chooses to pursue it, and as students choose to pursue it, it's still been an amazing experience. I wouldn't change anything. But at the same time, I think I can say that very confidently and very happily, in part, I think, because of what Buckley has done and what Buckley has contributed to the intellectual atmosphere, as well as the social atmosphere of the campus, because it's not just a group of conservatives hanging out every once in a while. It's also people from all over campus who have all sorts of views on all sorts of issues show up to our events, and they participate when we bring in very big name speakers, and it sort of sparks a conversation that lasts the next day and the next day and the next day. And so having that as part of the environment is, I think, really, really valuable. I think Buckley has been a really big contributor in making Yale as great as it is and will remain, hopefully.
I'm not sure that the administration would have started this program, but I think, frankly, they're very happy we're here because they can point to us and say, Yale is a bastion of free speech. Why? Lauren knows I feel strongly about this. I believe they are, I don't want to say using us. That's too strong, but you know what I'm getting at?
They're a little bit using us.
They're happy that we're here, I think.
Yeah. Sort of they go back and forth between that and grudging toleration,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, they like to point to us and say, look, free speech.
So
Just one comment. I was at the Harvard commencement 2 years ago when Michael Bloomberg warned about all this. And now the infection is really leaping out. What's been underground and 20 years ago, the water's boiling, but if there's any kind of way of partnering with other schools and duplicating what you're doing, it's so unique and it's so wonderful. And I really applaud you because 2 years ago, I was at my husband's 65th reunion, and Mrs. Solovey spoke and talked about the level of fear and anxiety among the students, and went into great detail about the teams of psychologists and psychiatrists because the fear levels were so great, which was astounding to the class of 1955. And, you know, as long as that idea is promoted, that there is so much fear and anxiety, how can people really stand up to the kind of pressure you're under? So it's all in leadership, isn't it? And I just applaud you so much for your fearlessness and for your
These
courage.
folks, by the way, do stand up too. I mean, they're not just hangers-on. They're folks who are leading.
So wonderful. Thank you.
On that note, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I definitely want to thank our panel here. So thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.